Jane Weiss. Mary Jane, Dr. Weiss is a professor at Endicott College in Massachusetts. She directs the master's program in ABA and autism and is a mentoring faculty member in the doctoral program. She's also the executive director of research at Melmark, which is a school for individuals with developmental disabilities. Her clinical and research interests center on defining best practice ABA techniques, evaluating the impact of ABA in learners with autism, teaching social skills to learners with autism, training staff to be optimally effective at instruction, maximizing family members' expertise and adaptation. Dr. Weiss serves on the scientific council of the Organization for Autism Research, is vice president of the Board of Trustees for Autism New Jersey, is a regular reviewer for a variety of professional journals, and is a frequent member of Service Committee for Behavior Analyst Certification Board. So that's my cheat sheet. Please sign in on chat. If you have any questions, put those in chat as well. And with that, I'll leave it up to Dr. Weiss.
Hi, everybody. And thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you today about one of my favorite topics, evidence-based interventions for autism. And I think that, you know, anytime we think about autism interventions, we have to think about it in the context of what the evidence is for the various interventions that we're exposed to. But I think it's a moving target, and I think there are a lot of things about our roles in working with families and on teams that make it challenging to constantly adhere to our own ethical code in this context and to stay abreast of the developments in evidence-based interventions, because it changes over time. And I think that's one of the things that makes it most challenging. I'm hoping you can all hear me just in terms of logistics and see me. I understand that they'll be collecting your questions, and that at the end of the time together, we'll leave some time for questions where we can intervene and discuss them in a group format. But I think because of the format and the numbers of people participating, that it probably would be disruptive and possibly impossible for me to track the questions as they're coming in. So I hope that works for all of you. So I want to just start with the word evidence-based practice, because I feel like evidence-based has become one of the biggest words, buzzwords, in the field and outside the field. And I think that some people think it's synonymous with ABA and use it to describe ABA and ABA alone. Many people talk about and have written about what the definition of evidence-based practice is. And I think it's important for us to look at that, because there isn't total consensus, and every resource that you consult about evidence-based practice uses a slightly different twist on it, or maybe has different nuances in their application of the term. Certainly they all do focus on science and scientific validation, but some more than others. And I think that it's important for us to kind of track that and discuss that in terms of what it means to us as a field. A number of years ago, when New Jersey was considering developing autism insurance legislation, which we did and which passed in the state legislature, I was asked by Autism New Jersey to testify at the state courthouse about the bill and about ABA and how ABA should be included in what would be considered as reimbursable services under the new legislation. And one thing that was really interesting to me is that a lot of other groups showed up that had a strong interest in the outcome of this legislation. For example, the people who did a lot of floor time or Greenspan work were there in very large numbers, and people who represented RDI, or Relationship Development Intervention, were there in large numbers. And they were objecting to the fact that Autism New Jersey was trying to pass legislation that would allow ABA, speech, and OT. I don't know why little lines are appearing, and I'm sorry about that. But it makes it interesting maybe for you as listeners. But they were fighting that and saying they didn't want it restricted to just ABA. that their intervention should also be included. And the interesting thing is that all of the people who testified on behalf of those interventions used the word evidence-based very freely and described themselves as evidence-based and said, we have evidence too. And I thought to myself, wow, this is so confusing for the legislators who have to make decisions about this. And I think it's confusing for us as practitioners of our field and others who practice in their fields. And because we have differing views of what evidence means, I think it makes it hard to have a unified definition, which then we would apply to many different procedures. Advancing my slides. Okay. So organizations that support the concept of evidence-based practice, and I went too many because I did hit it twice, are many, right? Almost every organization that you can think of endorses the concept of evidence-based practice and has supported the importance of evidence-based practice in service delivery across all kinds of developmental disabilities, mental health challenges, education, medicine, etc. One certainly, our own organizations certainly support that concept as well, all of the major organizations in applied behavior analysis. And so we could ask ourselves, why is there such relevance to autism spectrum disorder treatment from the context of evidence-based practice? And I think that it's uniquely important. It's important universally, but it's uniquely extra important, I feel like, to autism spectrum disorders because of the history of ineffective treatments. Because autism is what some people have called a fad magnet and continues to be. I've been, in the field of autism service delivery for decades, and that piece of it hasn't changed. It continues to attract miracle cures, faddish breakthroughs, a lot of reliance on clinical intuition or very non-rigorous, non-scientific kinds of approaches in marketing interventions that probably have no merit. And all of that, from our perspective, as individuals that value efficiency and effectiveness in treatment, all of that results in wasted time, in a lower likelihood of positive results in intervention, and really threatens the likelihood that we'll get the socially significant gains we're aiming to get because of time wasted with diluted interventions from other individuals. So we want to increase the chances of success. We want to increase the chances of independence. And so we rely on evidence-based practice to achieve those outcomes. But it's also very congruent with our worldview as behavior analysts. And evidence-based practice is also a way of thinking, I think, that's very consistent with the principles and tenets of behavior analysis. We want to promote analytic thought, database decisions, and skepticism. And I think that that's something that we value in a way that maybe other individuals don't, but I think keeps us open to the evolution of the science and the influx of new data within our science and outside our science, so that we can keep understanding the evolution of evidence-based practice as it applies to autism and as treatments evolve and are shown to be effective. So I think, when I think about that history of autism intervention and it being a fad magnet, I think about consumers. And, I honestly, sometimes I'm confused. With all the years I've spent in the field, it can be difficult for me to sort through some of the claims that come through and to really figure out where I sit on something or what kinds of data I'm looking for about particular interventions. And I think how much more complex it has to be for consumers, for parents of individuals with autism who are trying to figure out where to, put their hope and money and investment of time. And I think one of the things that makes that difficult is that if you do Google anything about autism intervention, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of procedures will come up, a few of which are evidence-based and many of which are non-evidence-based. Many of them will use the buzzword of evidence or evidence-based. Many of them will show that they have effective, that they have evidence of their own effectiveness and have data of some sort. We know from our training that all data are not equal. But it's very difficult for people who have not had that training to understand those subtle and nuanced kinds of issues. And I think that we have a long way to go as behavior analysts to educate consumers about levels of evidence. And maybe part of that is about educating individuals about the nature and assumptions of science. I think one of the things that I've been using for a long time in my career, and I still find really useful, is to think about the differences between science and pseudoscience and anti-science. And Gina Green wrote about that years ago in the Behavioral Interventions book, and many have written about it since then. But I think it's really helpful to help individuals categorize and to remind ourselves of what are the characteristics of things that are not really evidence-based, that don't share the scientific worldview. And a lot of the claims that come up when you Google autism interventions that are not in fact evidence-based really do fall into these pseudoscientific or anti-science kinds of categories. And pseudoscience, it's not based on hard data. It's largely anecdotal, so you will see lots of testimonials and stories of people whose lives were changed with these interventions, but you won't see a lot of data that demonstrates functional relations or any kind of control in that experimentation. There generally isn't what we look for, like things like ruling out other variables, other explanations as to why we might have seen this particular impact. And even more dangerous is anti-science. In anti-science, there's really a rejection of the scientific worldview that, even doing research on it is simply not possible, is antithetical to the intervention itself, that the testing of hypotheses would be a violation of the method. And very often, there's an element of belief, which is very odd when you really stop and think about it, that it's important that you believe in this intervention in order for it to work. And I have my best example, and I think you're going to agree that it's a really good example of anti-science is, and probably the best example of an intervention that falls into this is facilitated communication. Many of you may not be in the field long enough to remember how destructive that particular treatment was, and it still surfaces periodically. But at the time, which was like the late 1980s, early 1990s, facilitated communication, which was supported typing, where the individual was assisted to type out messages by somebody holding their wrist, most commonly, and they would type out messages often on a very small keyboard. And many individuals with autism who were previously, non-communicative or minimally communicative were supposedly typing out these very profound messages, often having to do with the deep feelings they had about being trapped inside autism, sometimes also including information like sexual abuse by family members, which had no other basis except the testimony of via facilitation. So if any of you have studied that in your travels, you know that that has been completely debunked from science. From a science perspective, we studied that, did double-blind tests, found out that 100% of the communications were coming from the facilitator, 0% of communications were coming from the individuals. But I went to a workshop. At the time I was working in Southern Jersey at a program for individuals with autism. We were losing a lot of kids. Because they were being sent to public schools with facilitators who could, take them to chemistry classes and, to advanced language arts classes. And, it was so much, from the parents' perspective, so much more appealing than the daily living skills we were focusing on at our center. And so I was sent up to Syracuse University, where Bicklin, who's the person who really promulgated the treatment in the United States, was doing workshops. And I will never forget this because it's the best example of anti-science I've ever seen. He put up a transparency, because we didn't have PowerPoints back then. It was a long time ago. So he put up a transparency, and it said, reasons for the method not working. Number one, subtle issues of disbelief. And I was so profoundly affected by that because it was so obviously an anti-scientific perspective. And he did say some of these other elements up there, that we couldn't possibly test it, that the individual would feel our doubt about the procedure if we were to test it. You know, I was calling the home office and saying, like, I've evaluated the situation and I am ready to come home. And they're like, no, it's a 3-day workshop. I often tell people it's the only religious revival I've ever been to. And it's true. But that is a very, very dangerous worldview. And it comes up in other elements. First of all, facilitated communication itself periodically resurfaces. I've heard it come back as supported typing and saved by typing. And a number of other people are still even calling it facilitated communication. So I think that we still have these challenges. And it's not the only intervention for autism out there that I think presents itself as anti-science, and I'll give an example of another one in a little while. But it's worrisome because of the closed nature of it in terms of no openness to scientific inquiry. So it's so circular, you know, that if I can't succeed at this because I in fact do have that item on the bullet that he wrote, reasons for the method not working, I had subtle issues of disbelief. So by definition, it won't work for me. And there's nothing that can be done about that. And that is really dangerous. So I feel like part of what we need to do is help people to really identify historically and now interventions that really fall into these categories of pseudoscience or anti-science, so that we can better identify things that could be really high risk in terms of leading to ineffective, inefficient intervention and wasted time, money, and hope for families who are faced with choices about interventions. So when we want to look back at what's evidence-based practice, so when we're identifying things, the themes that cut across all the different resources that are out there, there is consensus, there is good IOA, certain things crop up in every reading of them. One is that treatments have undergone scientific evaluation and have employed established research methodologies that have proven to be effective. And it usually does also include the integration of that available research with clinical expertise in the context of how we apply that. Sometimes there's a focus on deriving clinical statistical significance, and we'll talk more about that too, because single case design has also been getting increasing respect in that context, particularly when we're able to demonstrate multiple single case studies over a significant period of time. It also includes applying those empirically supported principles in case formulations, a body of scientific research that shows the practice has had effects across researchers. So it's always a bit preliminary to decide that an intervention has shown evidence if only one researcher has been able to demonstrate that effect. We like to see replication, but not just replication across researchers. And in particular, we like to see replication across researchers that aren't associated with that particular intervention. So think about why picture exchange communication system keeps going up the ladder of evidence-based practice categories, right? It was at one point, it was probably emerging and then probably efficacious. It keeps moving every time there's another analysis because we keep getting more independent studies by researchers not associated with the development of the protocol that continues to demonstrate its effectiveness. That's science at work. That's what we see in the evolution of a practice into the category of being evidence-based. It's a good example of that. And it's also the case that we look at treatments to have been measured against outcomes, that there are objective indices of progress, gains that can be empirically demonstrated, as opposed to subjective or vague claims of improvement. So the practices are generally based on rigorous, systematic, and objective procedures that are used to obtain reliable and valid knowledge. And so in psychology and medicine, themes keep coming up, and this is true in education as well, that replication, demonstration of clinical significance, being able to show that you had reliability and validity in your measurement systems, internal validity, that procedures were run as they were intended to have been run, treatment fidelity, peer-reviewed research, and a demonstration of a generalized effect. Those are elements that over and over again we see come up in the definitions of evidence-based practices. And categories exist within evidence-based practice to kind of summarize where we are in that. So something might be called emerging because we have demonstration of effectiveness, but we don't have replication across researchers, or we don't have treatment fidelity, or we don't have generality. And so things move up those categories as we get more confident in the demonstration of results. It's always possible that one study is really a bizarre lark, right? That it isn't going to be able to be replicable. We have to be able to demonstrate it again, or it's not useful and it wasn't real. And so that's why we focus so much on some of those particular elements. So as behavior analysts, what else matters to us in this context of evidence-based practice? One is a demonstration of functional relations, right? We always want to know what exactly was responsible for the change. And I see behavior analysts really seek to find that out even in our clinical interventions. If we do a multi-component treatment package, we want to know which of the components really did it. How many of these were actually essential versus how many of them, might have been superfluous. Because of that value I talked about earlier, efficiency and effectiveness. If it's not necessary, then it's possibly wasting precious intervention time to even have it as a component of the multi-element package. We want to know which ones truly matter. And there are huge threats to efficiency. A lot of people will say, well, it doesn't really matter as long as there was improvement, and it can't hurt. And in a clinical context, sometimes that's true, and it isn't important to know. But certainly in a research perspective, and mostly in a clinical perspective too, we would always prefer to know what exactly was responsible for that behavior change so that we can design the most efficient behavior intervention plans and instructional programs possible, and that we use only those interventions that are making a true difference in the learner's experience. So in autism treatment, that commitment to efficiency is very important. And I think that there are some threats to that in packaged interventions, in diluted interventions, and I think that there are more challenges to this in our clinical work than we sometimes realize. I often think about the series of articles by Jane Howard about comparing generic preschool intervention to autism-specific preschool intervention to ABA preschool intervention. And there was a great follow-up to that study in 2014, if you haven't seen it yet, which was really excellent. And what it showed was that that there is a dilution of our impact. So some ABA makes some difference, but the only really giant socially significant changes that we see happen in pure ABA interventions. And yet many of us are in circumstances where there is diluted treatment and there's a little bit of ABA. And some ABA, is better than no ABA. But if we use ABA along with other things, are we also reducing the effectiveness of our interventions? And I think that those studies are a wonderful part of what our field needs, because we have to answer those questions from a research base with empirical answers. It's just a black hole to talk about it from an opinion-based perspective. We have to have data to support those opinions, and we need to understand more about the nature of the packaged intervention and which elements of it are essential and how much dilution can occur before there's a negative impact in learner outcomes. And so I think that those are some of the kind of controversial thoughts that I have about evidence-based interventions is in the application of it, is in the real world, in the settings that we consult in and are employed in and don't necessarily have full control over all of those elements. How do we navigate some of those challenges as clinicians, and how do we solve some of those problems from a research perspective? In autism treatment, related services are often provided along with ABA. OT and speech are the most common ancillary services. Both of those professions have discussed the importance of evidence-based practice in their disciplines, but there's not as much research on their procedures that are commonly used as there are in ABA, especially in the OT realm. And clinicians in those fields might be guided more by training or common practice and what seems to work than by scientific evidence. Certainly, that's probably true in OT. But we know that evidence-based practice is what's desired, that there are varying criteria that exist for what constitutes evidence, and we need strategies to help wrestle with this so that we can gain more insight into the definition of evidence-based practices, and we can study interventions to help figure out which of them need to move up the ladder and which of them are not going to be able to move up that ladder. That can only happen with rigorous research with the criteria that we just talked about. Multiple studies done by multiple investigators, use of experimental designs, control for bias, reliability of measurement, operational definitions of your terms, control for internal and external validity threats, identification of independent and dependent variables, clear specification of the intervention details and treatment manuals, one of the 7 dimensions. We have to be technological, right? And we need everyone else to take that same level of specification to their procedures in order for them to be studied well. Several replication studies using within subject designs, replication studies involving 10 plus individuals. We know that, and that's what's maybe happening on the research end. I think that increasingly several people in the field are talking to us about the need to step up to the plate in the evidence-based practice kind of debates. Tristan Smith has done a number of lectures on regional and national conferences in the last few years talking about how behavior analysts are marginalized. We're not often even at the table of these discussions because of our reliance on single case designs, which only happens in our science. And he said we have to do some group studies in order to be able to sit at those tables. And it's difficult because we study and we teach and we believe that single case design is, far preferred because of the focus on the individual, and that group data loses that focus on the individual. And it's difficult for us to hear those messages, but I think increasingly people are kind of both working to get us at those tables to share what we can demonstrate in single case designs, but also getting several members of the field to do some of those group studies as well, in addition to all the work we do in single case, so that we can talk the same language as some of the other individuals who are making decisions about evidence-based practice. So taking us away kind of from the research realm for a moment and to talk a little bit about our challenges in practice. When I think about evidence-based practice and how it's impacted my career from a challenge perspective, it's mostly in the realm of working in interdisciplinary teams with different worldviews and different procedures, and working with families who are searching for interventions to make a difference in their child's life and who stumble across something that they very much want to try. And the struggle for me has been in how do I help guide those decisions, respect parents' autonomy in that context, and still serve as a resource to them in making sure that we can be as effective as we possibly can with their child. And I bet that you all have those challenges too, because I think that is where it becomes difficult for us, is when we really have to navigate with colleagues and with families some of these moments when we have differing opinions on which interventions to pursue and which interventions make sense for this individual. So I'm going to give you 3 examples that I think kind of highlight some of those clinical issues. So one is a BCBA is approached by a former client who says that the child's current teacher has recommended auditory integration training. She's hopeful that the long-standing processing problems might be addressed through this intervention, and she's wondering what the BCBA knows of it or thinks about it. So that's scenario 1. Another one, a parent of a child says at the IEP meeting that she's finally going to try the gluten-free diet. She recently saw Jenny McCarthy on CNN, and she wants to see what happens for her son on the diet. And the third one is a parent has asked that the school do rapid prompting or SOMA with their child. I don't know if you have much of that in your part of the world, but I'll talk about it in a minute. But the school was invited to a session which the BCBA attended, and the BCBA became very concerned on many levels about the nature of the intervention and about the appropriateness of the content taught. She saw an adolescent with severe issues in every area of functioning being prompted to respond to material about the Bushmen of the Kalahari and the Lewis and Clark expedition. She believed that the responses were almost entirely the result of inadvertent prompting or over-prompting, and she's been asked to find a way to incorporate the intervention into the school program. What should she do? So I chose these examples because I think these are the kinds of things that we run into. And it's not the same as talking about evidence-based practice when you read the literature. It's evidence-based practice in our everyday lives. And how do we navigate these kinds of situations? So I think there are some parts of our ethical code that help us navigate these challenges. And so I always start there because I often find the answers there. That's another very strong area of interest for me, is ethical practice and behavior analysis. And there are several points that assist us in our code in this. And they're focused on effectiveness and our commitment to effective intervention, and on our obligation to evaluate the impact of treatments. So we're told in Section 209 of the new code that came into place in January 1st of this year, which I'm sure you all know, that clients have a right to effective treatment, procedures that have been in the research literature and are adapted to the individual, and that we always have the obligation to advocate for and educate the client about scientifically supported, most effective treatment procedures. And I think that's very interesting, strong language, right? That helps me. We always have the obligation to advocate for and educate the client about scientifically supported, most effective treatment. And that we have the responsibility to advocate for the amount and level of service provision and oversight required to meet the defined behavior change goals. So that helps me when I see SDs like that in our ethical code that tell me what I'm supposed to be focused on in terms of this learner's best interest. And it also says that we review, under D, we review and appraise the effects of any treatment that we're aware of that might impact the goals of the behavior change program and the possible impact on the behavior change program to the extent possible. It also says we have a responsibility, Section 7, to colleagues, that we have an obligation to bring attention to and resolve any ethical violations that we perceive by colleagues. So going back to our dilemmas, and after looking at the code, what can we do in that context? So I think it's always, always, always good to educate the team. I think we have to be careful about that because I think sometimes we don't do that in the most collegial way. I think behavior analysts have, sadly, sometimes a well-earned reputation as being arrogant, and I think we have to work on our collegial skills. I always say to people, like, these people have master's degrees too. Like, these people went to, graduate training programs too. They have expertise too. So I think we have to be careful about the way that we convey what we believe needs to be shared with the team. And so I think, that's interpersonal skills, right? But I think from a content perspective, we have an obligation to share with the team what's known about those particular procedures. And I think that's an always category for me. And then I think sometimes we can create a single case intervention to evaluate the impact of an intervention at that level of the individual. I don't think we always have to do that. And I'm going to talk about that. I think there are some red light procedures. But I think that often it's possible to do that. And I think that sometimes that's a much easier way to come to consensus as a team that's divided on a particular issue is, can we make this a database discussion? Can we take this to a level of data analysis in a way that would objectify it? So it's not my opinion versus the OT's opinion versus the speech and language pathologist's opinion. That, to me, that just never goes well. I like to try to figure out, how can we find out whether this is uniquely helpful to this individual? And I think that sometimes that can be a really nice solution. So let's revisit the ethical dilemmas that I posed. Auditory integration training. I don't know how much you know about auditory integration training, but it lacks an empirical basis. There are no supporting data for its effectiveness. ASHA, the American Speech and Hearing Association, has a position statement against it. So does the American Academy of Pediatrics. And I just love those facts. And I think you should love those facts too. Because I think sometimes it looks like here we are, the geeky behavior analysts, poo-pooing everything that's not behavior analytic, for reasons that are associated with our own biases. And I think we have to educate ourselves about what other disciplines are saying about these interventions and how they are evaluating these interventions. Because a lot of parents are very interested in the fact that the American Academy of Pediatrics does not recommend it. And I think that that is very powerful information for a team to look at. In this particular example, looking at all of those data, I would say I wouldn't do a single case study to evaluate its effectiveness at the level of the individual when we've got position statements against it, when there's absolutely no data supporting it. To me, that's one where I think the discussion with the team would be more about those variables from my perspective. What about rapid prompting? So rapid prompting, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but it got a lot of attention a number of years ago. It was developed by a parent of an individual with autism whose name is Soma Mukhopadhyay, and she lives in Texas and has the HALO Institute down in Texas devoted to the dissemination of this technique. And it's quite similar to FC in that there's the use of letter boards to assist individuals to communicate. And like FC, it generally falls into that category of unlocking the individual with autism. So she will herself present about the work she did with her son. And I went to a presentation that she did a few years ago about it, and she talked about how they found out that he had an intense interest in Mesopotamia, the culture of ancient Mesopotamia. And so those kinds of things that are often said in the context of FC also pop up, I feel like, in rapid prompting. So one of the things about that intervention, think back to what we talked about pseudoscience and anti-science. Belief is a variable in this context too. And it's really not a teachable technology. I was once in a situation consulting with a school, and several of the kids were seeing her for rapid prompting. And they wanted me to try to study it. And I wanted to explore whether it was studyable, for lack of a better word. There must be a better word than that. Able to be studied. So I wanted to look at it from that perspective. And I spoke with several individuals from that institute. And I was trying to manualize it. I was trying to figure out, okay, like, what is it? Let's teach it to people, and then we can study it. And they said it's not a teachable technology. That really, it's kind of a gift that the developer of it has, that no one has approached her level of expertise with it. There's apparently one woman she's worked with for many, many years, I think in Ohio, that is getting close. But it's not something that can be manualized, and it's not something that could be taught to large numbers of people. So I concluded that if it's not a teachable technology and it's not researchable, then it doesn't have any relevance in terms of really exploring it, because it falls into kind of like a guru category or like a gift category, that maybe there is this amazing clinician that has done these things, but it isn't something that can be scientifically investigated. So my answer to that one is also a no. I see it because of the anti-science elements, the inability to study it, belief as a variable, believe that you're going to be able to unlock them. And she readily said in the talk that I went to, where people said, do you think it's similar to FC? She said yes, but she thought it was better than FC because she thinks she understood the brain better than Bicklin did. And so I think that to me also falls into a red light procedure. And the third one was the gluten-free diet. So, the gluten-free diet is really very prevalent, and the studies on it have not been very encouraging about its effectiveness, and there have been some risks that have been documented in pediatric journals, including nutritional deficiencies in kids who are on it long term. So I think it's really important that those risks get discussed with parents. I think, though, there are a lot of kids with very unusual gastrointestinal issues on the autism spectrum. There are a lot of kids with very unusual autoimmune, allergy, sensitivity issues on the autism spectrum. And so I feel like this is an area where we need medical input and we need medical collaboration. And if that sensitivity or allergy is confirmed, I think this should be methodically tracked. I think in specific situations with medical collaboration, it might be very appropriate to evaluate the impact of that. Now, I think that happens in like 0.0001% of individuals who are doing the gluten-free diet, and that's a problem. But I think, looking at it from like stepping back and saying, what are the circumstances and how could we navigate it in particular instances, that's how I think about that particular one. So the bottom line is I think some procedures should not be investigated. I call them red light procedures. I didn't make that up. I'm sure bazillions of people have said it, but the group I know said it is Autism New Jersey. They have a great resource of red light, yellow light, and green light procedures, which I think is really helpful to parents. So I would encourage you to go on the website and use that. And they talk about the red light procedures that they've identified where there's evidence of harm, and FC would fall into that category, as would chelation, where there's a documented or clear absence of effect, position statements against them, or where anti-science is a significant thread, as we would see in FC or in rapid prompting. So I think when I think about my decision tree, about evidence-based practice and how I serve people with autism in that context, I think about things in that way. I think about my own red light, yellow light, and green light procedures, and I think about how to help people understand why I think something is a red light procedure. And these are some of the ways that I think really help people to understand that. And then I think there are some not yet empirically validated procedures, yellow lights, that might be explored with data when a couple of conditions are in place. Operational definitions are agreed upon and a data collection system is put in place, and the team agrees to a data-driven ultimate decision on continuance. So I think if we can get consensus in the room that this is what we're tracking, this is what we're trying to change, this is how we're taking the data, this is how long we're going to give it, and this is what we're going to do when those data come in. We're going to continue it if it works, and we're going to discontinue it if it doesn't work. I think if we can get that kind of movement in our teams and that kind of consensus about how to make those decisions on an individual level, we'll really be going a long way toward effective intervention and toward reducing the exposure to ineffective interventions. Again, bottom line, families will pursue these interventions. They will not, for the most part, do only ABA. I think we can have a useful function in teams and working with families to help make database decisions about what's working, what's not working, what should continue, what should not continue, what do we invest in, and what do we not invest in. And I really feel strongly about that first line of influence being the education of the team, because a lot of times that's the end of the story. Everybody at the table might be convinced by the position statements. And, we can save our energy for other things. For other interventions, we should design data-based methods to assess the impact, because the data really are not all in on that particular intervention, and we could figure out what it does for this particular individual. So what makes something behavior analytic? What makes us behavior analysts in our approach to these things? I think it's a worldview. I don't think it's a hat we can take on and off. We value science. We value parsimony. We're data-driven. We work in compliance with our ethical code. And we rely on scientific evidence and empirical validation in how we select procedures. And I think a great compass in all of this is the 7 dimensions. I go back to that all the time, and I think, are these interventions fulfilling the 7 dimensions? Are they applied? Are they behavioral? Are they analytic? Can we show a functional relation? Are they technological? Are the procedures really clearly outlined? Is it effective? Are we demonstrating generality? And maybe the most important one, is it conceptually systematic with the science of ABA? Or is it antithetical to the science of ABA? Because if it's antithetical to the science of ABA, it really can't pass any other test, right? So I like to go back to that as a resource. And, we could use the 7 dimensions to look at our own interventions within ABA, to look at our own procedures within ABA, and to look at our recommendations of what we're assessing. I think we can add to the scientific study of ancillary interventions and related services, and I think we can help consumers make informed and data-based choices at the level of the individual. And I often think, that is probably our niche in these teams, is to be able to help individuals do that. And I also think that we need to develop certain skills that help us stay on the path of evidence-based interventions. One is self-monitoring. Am I compliant with the code? How do I stack up against this? What should I change about what I'm doing? What could I do better? I think that's something behavior analysts do well. I think we're trained to do that, but I think this is an area that we can work on. I think we also need to help each other collegially, to give each other the strength to pursue, addressing some of these issues when we're confronted with them. And I think we need ways in our organization to monitor for drift patrol. Have we fallen off the path? And there's my contact info. If any of you would like to stay in touch with me or ask me follow-up questions privately on email, I would be fine with that. But I guess now would also be a good time to open it up to the questions that might have come in while I was talking.
Hey, Mary Jane. So this is Sean Quigley. Made it. Appreciate
the
conversation. Do you hear me, Mary Jane?
I can hear you.
Okay. This is Sean Quigley.
Hello, Sean.
Hey. So I appreciate Mary Jane spending time with us and doing that. So a couple of things before we do questions. You're going to see that on your chat box, it just popped up. In order to receive your CEU credits for the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, you need to go and fill out the survey, and that link was just posted to the chat. And then also remember to sign out so we know you were here for the whole thing. And I don't think there was any questions that came through on chat while you were talking, Mary Jane. So if there's any from the audience here on site or distance, if you want to put those into chat, and we will take those, and I'll help facilitate them.
Great.
It's a bunch of crickets around here. Crickets. So.
How do you put things into chat?
Oh, that's on the computer. So if you're on the computer, you would chat in and type in your question. So yeah, if you have a question, you get to just ask it.
Well, what's the state of data-driven, et cetera, with those others like floor time and she was mentioning?
So Mary Jane, we have a person that's asking what's like the status or the what's the evidence like for like floor time, and you mentioned a few other kind of intervention strategies. So we want someone to maybe, or someone's wanting you to maybe comment on those. What's the data?
Sure. I think the National Autism Center's most recent compilation of all that, put that as emerging, because there has been a study or two that has shown some demonstration of positive impact. Now, a lot of behavior analysts were really upset about that. But, you know, that's actually the very low rung on the ladder. So it's not exactly a huge endorsement of it. And I think time will tell. You know, I feel like those things take care of itself, because studies will come in. There'll either be multiple studies by multiple independent researchers with all the elements we talked about that bump it up the ladder, or there won't be. So I think it's very, very early in the research stages for it, and I think, you know, time will tell.
Yeah, perfect. So we had another person ask a similar question in terms of hyperbaric oxygen chambers.
That one we can cross off the list. There's actually a study that came out on that by a behavior analyst. Dorothea Lerman did a study on that that showed absolutely no impact on that. That the studies that have come out on that have not been supportive of its impact. It's very sad, because it's, you know, very expensive and there's some potential risk. And so I think it's worrisome. But you can tell people that there's just nothing positive about that that's been published to this date.
Okay. And so someone asked in relation to hyperbaric, they were asking a question about the specific study. So you mentioned the Lerman. So many of these, you can go to Google Scholar and type in like Lerman hyperbaric chamber, and you're going to get that. It should link to some of the other ones, probably, Mary Jane, that you're going to reference. But do you have any quick authors for some of our participants to go Google and find for themselves?
I can follow up with that if you want. I can send you a list of a couple of key, you know, studies in different areas, and I'd be happy to send that along to help make it more efficient.
Okay, if you sent that to me, anyone that's on here listening, I will send that out to the New Mexico ABA mailing list. So if you're a part of that list, you'll see it. If you're not a part of that list, then you'll need to email me directly, Sean Quigley at the CDD, and we'll get it to you. So,
is this the way you boost your membership?
The trade secrets, Mary Jane.
Exactly.
And you were kind of mentioning, and I wanted to follow up on a point when you were talking about like National Autism Standards Report about like floor time, that there's some limited data that pushed it into that emerging, but that like other people will critique some of our standards for defining evidence-based, like Dr. Jim Todd out in Michigan will talk about, you know, again, what are we talking about? As you said, Mary Jane, it's a very limited sample size at the moment. Just
it really is.
Emerging category, or even some of the ones that are in the evidence-based practice category, they're still, you know, we might say not as much evidence as we would like, as many.
Totally. And I think it will all shift over time. I think there will become more universal standards. I think there will be more rigor, and I think there'll be shifting of interventions out of certain categories, I think.
Yeah, perfect. Did I miss a question on there, Patrick? Did I get all that were coming through?
I think so.
Okay. Okay. So any other questions, comments? We have another question.
I would be happy to talk to anybody, you know, follow up on email with anybody that had additional questions too. So don't hesitate if you would like to.
Okay, we have one more question here.
Sure.
I'm not sure how to word this, but at the beginning of her talk, it sounded like she was saying the single case type of studies were becoming more reputable.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
But that doesn't really go with, you know, multiple studies. I mean, how do you?
So I think both things are happening. So I think we are getting more respect for single case designs, and some of the evidence-based practice guidelines are now including, you know, at least 9 single case studies with at least 4 participants or something like that. So we're starting to see it even get into the criteria, and that is excellent. But I also think that it's not enough. And if you listen to people like Tris Smith, who really is in those circles at all the grant meetings, he's sort of saying to us, you know, you're going to have to enter this arena too and speak their language too if you want to be fully participating. And, you know, he himself has done some of the best group studies in our field with the, you know, original Lovaas studies, replications, and whatnot. So we need people like him that have the skills to do that and can be kind of translational between both worlds. And I think he's right about that. And I think we're lucky to have people like him who can do that for us and help others among us learn to do that.
So Mary Jane, would you say that it's fair to say, even though single case designs bring certain strengths, they also have certain limitations, just like group designs have strengths and limitations. And so to have a complete data set, you need to have perhaps a plethora of single case designs and group designs to answer the strengths and weaknesses across both designs?
Yes. Yeah. And I think if we don't do that, then we're going to be limited in impact. Okay. If we do that, I think we can have full impact.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I
really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me. I'd come again if you ask me. It was a lot of fun, and I hope it was interesting and thought-provoking.
Yes, very much appreciated. There's multiple comments. I don't know if you're seeing them on your chat box about people thanking you and appreciative of your time. So.
Oh, how nice.
Yep. All right. Well,
thank you.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.